he's essentially saying The Hobbit was not meant to be a part of Middle-earth when I started it.
Before the Rings of Power, there were the Silmarils. Before Sauron, there was his master Morgoth. Before Aragorn and Arwen, there was Beren and Luthien. Join us as we explore Tolkien and all the ages of Middle-earth with your hosts from theonering.com, Jonathan Watson and Michael Grumbine.
Michael, many folks have been asking, how many episodes of Exploring Tolkien have you done?
Many.
Well, no, actually many, but actually very few people ask that. But I decided, guys, you might notice if you're listening to the podcast, we're now putting numbers, because I know a lot of people like to know, like, where can I go to find this part? Where can I go to find that episode? Or where should I start? And so you'll see now that every episode is numbered if you look at our podcast. But this is number 122. 122,
which is very cool and very sad, because it means we missed the 111st episode, which would have been fun to mention. This is the 111st episode.
Yes, indeed. I wonder what the 111st episode was. It's the changes to chapter 2 to The Hobbit, the Tolkien in his rewrite, in his 1960 attempted rewrite of The Hobbit.
Before the Rings of Power.
That was the 111st one.
All right, so this is 122.
122, guys, and number 11 of it. We're going to go through the first part of chapter 4, Overhill and Underhill. And in my copy of The Hobbit, by the way, U is not capitalized in the Underhill, which was interesting. I'm not sure exactly why, but
in mine it is. I don't know why.
This is a Kindle version. I blame Amazon then. They're usually the culprit.
Yeah, they've made themselves into the villain in the last 2 years.
Oh, man. No doubt. All right. So I want to bring up one thing that Fra in our Discord chat brought up a couple days ago. And we've been talking about how Elrond was a fortunate coincidence for Tolkien, that he used the name and Rivendell became the place, and then it grew into a larger myth about, retreating to Rivendell after the battle with Sauron and all that sort of stuff. And so Fra, I thought he had this really cool thing. And by the way, guys, he's a member. So he gets the extended podcast, and we'll get to the extended podcast where we're going to talk about what we think Tolkien should have changed in this chapter. I think we might do that in every extended podcast because of us going through his rewrite, and he abandoned it after three chapters, and we're now in the 4th chapter. So we're going to take a look at that. And we're also going to take a look at the differences between goblins and orcs. Are there differences? Should we worry about those differences? What does Tolkien say about the differences between goblins and orcs? So we're going to do that in our extended podcast. You can get that by going to theonering.com/member or theonering.com/Patreon if you want to become a member there. It's $4 a month. First month is free, as usual. And thanks to our sponsors, Lynn and Rich, who give above and beyond to support us and keep us going. So Fra brought up this cool little bit about how, and we'll get into it this episode too, actually, speaking of Tolkien's trip to Switzerland. And so Fra took a trip to Switzerland, and he noticed, as he had heard at some point, that the patterned roofs of Rivendell that Peter Jackson used were actually also used in the film to inspire this. So you can see this patterned roof, and even the way that these little parapets and spires are. It's very similar to Rivendell, and I don't know if you look in the video, you can see I actually have the Lego Rivendell back here, and the pattern is similar. And so if you look at it like that, right, you can actually see, like, oh yeah, there's this sort of the tiled shingle pattern with the same style of I don't know, what do you call this little? It's a little, I don't know, structure on the left. Tolkien had that in Rivendell too. So or Peter Jackson had that in Rivendell too. A cool little coincidence.
Yeah,
I don't know what you call that.
My architect brother would know, but I don't know the name of that ornamentation. Like little, you talk about the little parapet thing, right? Yeah,
right here on the left hand side. Which, sorry guys, I'll post this in the video that goes up. I'm seeing if I can find a quick one here of Rivendell. Yeah, it's a little hard to find. In any case, kind of cool. Like, these coincidences happen, and so they this is why Peter Jackson's film did have a great look, because it was based in the real world, and the real world that Tolkien saw that probably inspired him. We're gonna get into more detail on that in this episode of going through The Hobbit, chapter 4. And so before we actually do that, I want to bring up this week's
Hobbit Facts.
So there are a lot of people who really try really hard to say, we're going to have to retcon everything that Tolkien wrote in The Hobbit into The Lord of the Rings, which is really hard to do. Like it makes it kind of tough because he didn't write it, as we said, as part of Middle Earth. And some people are like, well, no, he did. Like he knew what he was writing, and he was coming from a place from having already created Middle Earth. Well, no, actually he didn't, because in a 1966 interview with the BBC, I think it was 66, maybe it was 64, because there were a couple different interviews. In any case, the date doesn't matter. He was interviewed by the BBC, and he does admit that The Hobbit was not originally a part of Middle Earth. In fact, I would say it was probably even more like Rover Random, which, for those of you who don't know, was a story Tolkien wrote about his son's toy dog. Yeah, that was lost. And so in order to sort of, I guess, placate his son, he wrote this entirely long, well, it's a novella pretty much, of what happened to this dog that went on journeys into the moon and the sand wizard. And I can't remember all this sort of stuff, but it was,
cool.
it feels like The Hobbit in a way. But this is what he said to the interviewer when he was asked about The Hobbit. And he wrote, time passed and the hobbits grew into this world. As a matter of fact, what really happened was that the cause of having already constructed the world, they became drawn to it. The world existed in posse. I'm not sure what that means. In posse, P-O-S-S-E.
It means in potential. It's
potential.
the Latin verb to be able to be. Posse.
Glad you're here, because I would never have known that. And the world existed in posse and in a large-scale plan before The Hobbit was written. The Hobbit was, in fact, originally an attempt to write something outside it, and then drew into it. So The Hobbit was not meant. He's essentially saying The Hobbit was not meant to be a part of Middle Earth when I started it, and a lot of people have trouble with that. But then the world was so big and he couldn't get away from it that it was just drawn into that. And maybe that fortunate incident of having Elrond as an appropriate name for the person that he needed Bilbo to stop by and talk to in Rivendell, that's what was the final sort of the snick of the key that opened the door to into Middle Earth there.
I can see that being a real possibility, like the way Tolkien's mind works, and he builds things one to another. Unlike a modern author in fantasy or fiction author who goes to build a world, and he has a world, and then he's this is my story about this, and then he goes and tells another story about another. Brandon Sanderson is an exception to this, and more Tolkien like, because he ended up joining his worlds together, fictional why. But most fiction writers don't, and for Tolkien, the lines between them are not absolute, and so the Hobbit was able to grow and become a part of Lord of the Rings, and it did have to grow. Yeah,
and I feel like for something this large, right? I'm sure Tolkien also thought, like, well, if I'm going to do something this big, and maybe this is more subconscious. My life's work has been to create this world, even though when he was asked, like, why did you create this whole world? And he just sort of shrugs, because I wanted to, when he's asked that. But like, he couldn't help but have something this significant like The Hobbit be drawn into that world, where something smaller, shorter, like a Tom Bombadil, like even the poetry that he wrote, it wasn't necessarily it, but everything, it was the magnet that drew everything into this world. And Rover Random, at some point, if he would have done another story, I bet somehow he would have figured out a way to make the connection between that story and Middle Earth somehow. I think he just loved Middle Earth and the creation he had so much. Like there was he was drawn to it, and so his stories by default had to be drawn to it as well. And so The Hobbit.
One of the on a total nerdy side note, I know our listeners from a long time will have known that I have played and do play occasionally the Lord of the Rings online game, which is in
nerd.
Yep, I am a nerd. Amazingly faithful to Tolkien. They do a really good job, as much as you can for a modern MMO. But they actually have there's a place you can go, a sort of out of the way region, and in a camp somewhere there's a old man telling a story, and the story is the Rover Random story, and you have to go on a quest to find the toy dog. It's pretty cool.
See, that's a member Barry I'm okay with doing, as opposed to what we saw in some other TV shows and what they try to do nowadays with Star Wars and everything else. Like
exactly
like an actual thing. All right, guys. So there you have it. The Hobbit facts. Middle Earth and The Hobbit were not originally connected. Completely separate.
Until they weren't.
I'm just wondering, like, at what point, like, it would have been great to know, like, if I could interview him now, like, okay, so what point did you say, like, no, I'm making the mental shift from outside Middle Earth to inside Middle Earth because it was drawn to it, or did it happen gradually? At some point, he just has to say to himself, okay, this is Middle Earth. I'm going to start doing all the things.
Yeah, you might get a grumpy reaction from him on that, like trying to tie him down to a specific date, especially for a process like that.
I mean, where in the book did he decide? Like, now I'm in Middle Earth. That's all. Yeah.
Interesting.
Is it in the Misty Mountains when he was talking about Moria? Is it when he got to, because it feels still like Bjorn, for instance, is not Middle Earthy based on the Lord of the Rings Middle Earthiness, but he's drawn into it. It feels like the spiders are not as Middle Earthy as the spider as Ungoliant or Shelob in the Lord of the Rings. So anyway, interesting. I don't want to. Yeah, that's just a lot of speculation that we can get, like, have a discussion for late in one night over a cigar, but not here on a podcast. Okay, guys, let's get into chapter 4 of The Hobbit: Overhill and Underhill. And we're going to stop. Actually, this is going to be pretty brief, and like we're not going very far into this chapter. Yeah, for us, just because I want to concentrate next week on the goblins, the orcs, right, being drawn into Moria there, and here I want to just concentrate up to that point, so up until they get abducted, essentially. And so when I read this, I found that I started comparing this mentally to the journey from Rivendell to the Misty Mountains in The Lord of the Rings, right? This is the journey from Rivendell to the Misty Mountains in The Hobbit. And and this goes back to where Tolkien was much more brief and non-specific. I don't like to use the word general, but just non-specific in the journey that they took. And how I appreciate the specificity of the world that he created in the Lord of the Rings more, because in here he mentions, most of the paths were cheats and deceptions and led nowhere or to bad ends, and most of the passes were infested by evil things and dreadful dangers. And so that stuck out to me in the sense that, okay, the evil things, we have Caradhras, so that was an evil thing there, and the dreadful dangers of the Watcher in the Water. Or the snows and Caradhras are kind of together. But I think that he doesn't really get into the details of what that happens. And what we get in the details of is, and it's still so brief, is like the stone giants. And they're not threatening like they are in the Hobbit films. Long may they not be watched. And and so anyway, that was my initial takeaway. It feels so brief, this journey to the Misty Mountains here, whereas in the Lord of the Rings, there's so much more detail. There's so much more that goes on in that point.
Yep. And to that point, what I will add is, I think that's a natural attribute of the kind of story that he's telling. Namely, what I mean is, this is a story told by a fireside. We've said this before. I'm going to keep saying it again. Yeah. This is a story told to his children by the fireside. And in the story told to children by the fireside, the fact that there's dangerous mountains means that's a thing that's there, and your characters have to overcome, and there's adventures that happen in them. But those mountains aren't really a place in your mind. They don't have a lot of characteristics. I mean, they have some characteristics, but they don't have they don't occupy this space the way a piece of geography does, that then you would dig in on. They're just a danger that they go through, and there's some giants. So the interesting part about the mountains isn't the mountains, it's the giants. And then it's the cave, and then it's the goblins, and then it's what happens after that. And so the mountains themselves are less of a place. That's what I'm saying. They're more of just a thing to move through as you tell the story. And so that's what I see when I see the story. And now it turns out that these mountains, and I learned this thanks to the lovely annotated edition that I'm reading through right now. Did not know this before, but the mountains were inspired heavily. I've often wondered why actually the Misty Mountains as drawn look like Alpine mountains. Well, it turns out Tolkien took a trip to the Alpine Mountains in Switzerland in 1911. And a lot of some of the big picture and details from The Hobbit and what the Misty Mountains look like and act like comes from his time there, wherein he, as he says, he almost perished.
It's and it's funny because this is the part where it does get really specific. Because he's writing down what he recalled in in this trip he took to the the Swiss Alps in 1911.
Right.
Before there was even a railroad across the Swiss Alps. That actually was finished in 1912. So there was no way. This is pristine wilderness in a way, right? There very few people go here. And so he recalls this, and we can, if you look at the Hobbit and you see where he's talking about the thunderstorm that happened and how these, the rock giants and the huge stones tumbling down. It's all inspired by this. So let me read this. It's a little bit long, but I think it's really, unless you have it, Michael. But I've cut it down. Let me get through it. But it's really important because it really distinctly recalls what he wrote in The Hobbit. And so this is a journey he took with his aunt, I think, and brother, and
he ended up in a party of 12, which
party
is
of
funny.
12. That's right. Yeah.
So, but he took a trip. I don't remember who it was with England, but when they're up in the mountains and they're traveling through the mountains, the party of 12, which is interestingly close to the party of 14 that they're.
Oh, hey, that's a good point. Yeah,
that Bilbo's in.
Right. So this is what he wrote. Our wanderings mainly, and this was in a letter to his son Michael, I believe. Yeah, a letter to his son Michael in 1967. So he's recalling it 55 years later. Our wanderings mainly on foot in a party of 12 are not now clear in sequence, but leave many vivid pictures as clear as yesterday. We went on foot carrying great packs. We slept rough. The menfolk, often in hayloft, since we were walking by map and avoided roads and never booked, and after a meager breakfast fed ourselves in the open. One day we went on a long march with guides up the Lech Glacier. All right, I'm going to show you a quick picture actually here of what he saw. This is
without the train.
Without the train, right? That's what I have to point out. There was no train. So he was hiking in places like this along mountain ranges like this.
And if that doesn't look like the Misty Mountains, I don't know what does.
Totally. And this is a peak called the Jungfrau, or essentially the Virgin, the young woman. And he said it left an indelible mark on him. It's the westernmost and highest point of a gigantic 10-kilometer wall dominating the valleys of Lauterbrunnen and Grindelwald. Lauterbrunnen again is the valley that inspired Rivendell. So all together an inspiration here. And if you're listening to the podcast, I'll have this also linked in the show notes. So one day we went on a long march with guides up the Lech Glacier, and I came near to perishing. We had guides, but either the effects of the hot summer were beyond their experience, or they did not much care, or we were late in starting. Anyway, at noon we were strung out in file along a narrow track with a snow slope on the right going up to the horizon, and on the left a plunge down into a ravine. The summer of that year had melted away much snow, and stones and boulders were exposed that, I suppose, were normally covered. The heat of the day continued the melting, and we were alarmed to see many of them starting to roll down the slope at gathering speed, anything from the size of oranges to large footballs, and a few much larger. They were whizzing across our path and plunging into the ravine. Hard pounding, ladies and gentlemen. They started slowly, and then usually held a straight line of descent, but the path was rough, and one also had to keep an eye on one's feet. I remember the member of the party just in front of me, an elderly schoolmistress, gave a sudden squeak and jumped forward as a large lump of rock shot between us, about a foot at most before my unmanly knees. But that, and when you think about that, one, it is uncanny how close that is to walking along the edges of the Misty Mountains with the dwarves while there is while the stone giants, right, are throwing footballs essentially, and he uses the word football here, and also in the book he says, like Thorin says, if we don't get blown off or drowned or struck by lightning, we shall be picked up by some giant and kicked sky high for a football. Which again is kind of weird that he left the word football in there after trying to take out all the other modern day references in his 1967 republishing of The Hobbit.
Right.
But clearly, this is where the specificity of the world. This is my favorite part of the chapter so far. That we feel it and we see it, and we have he is subcreating this whole world in our mind's eye more so than the general, more like we're on a journey type story, like you mentioned, right? The style of this type of book is does not usually lend itself to that kind of specificity, but because he had this experience, he brought it forth right here.
Well, and even brought it even more specifically. So you just read his own experience in the Alps, and
Mm-hmm.
even with the rocks tumbling down in front of them, and at one point between him, a foot ahead of him, between him and the next person in the line. And in The Hobbit, it says when they were first traveling through the first couple paragraphs, it was getting bitter cold up there, and the wind came shrill among the rocks. Boulders, too, at times came galloping down the mountainsides, let loose by midday sun upon the snow, and passed among them, which was lucky, or over their heads, which was alarming. So he actually put the rolling boulders that came right between them into the Hobbit itself. So his direct experience of rocks rolling down the mountains right in front of him, he inserted into the Hobbit. And so that was pretty cool. And even the fact that the boulders have been let loose by the sun melting the snow,
Right.
he specifically alludes to in his when he speaks about his own experience.
Yeah. And not only that, he also experienced a large thunderstorm when he was also doing that trip. And he said, let's see, there was a thunder battle. He did call it in a letter to Joyce Reed in 1961. He said it was a bad night in which we lost our way and slept in a cattle shed. And even that kind of that's like going to the cave in the middle of this storm, right? We had to find a place to go to. So I feel like, right what well, he knew this here. And so this was a real experience, and the feelings that he brings forth, even though I don't really, where he's again asking where in The Hobbit, he writes, how terrific a really big thunderstorm can be down in the land and in a river valley, especially at times when two great thunderstorms meet and clash. I don't like the whole breaking the narration wall right there, but he experienced this. But I like his description now, right? This is probably, when it comes to prose, I really love this. Yes. More terrible still are thunder and lightning in the mountains at night, when storms come up from east and west and make war. The lightning splinters on the peaks, and rocks shiver, and great crashes split the air and go rolling and tumbling into every cave and hollow, and the darkness is filled with overwhelming noise and sudden light. He is giving mass to sound, right? He's saying it's filling it, it's tumbling down. And so a thunder battle, and so I think that thunder battle, the way he experienced it on his trip to Switzerland, is very indicative of how he ended up writing this as as a giant thunderstorm, but also the stone giants, right? They work together to create this surreal scene of danger, of like, I am small, I have no place to go, I'm going to die if I stay out here. The absolute terror of the world around you, right? You're no longer comforted. Yes. Right? The Hobbit hole is so far away. There's nowhere to go. What are we going to do? Something he really experienced when they had to settle for some shed that they found in the middle of a valley, probably, or on a hillside somewhere, to endure a thunder battle, like you wrote.
It's pretty awesome.
Yeah.
I just want to point out, you mentioned the breaking of the fourth wall, where he's talking directly to the reader, and how you didn't like that. And I agree with you. It doesn't, but he does it a number of times. He does it then that you read. He does it when he's talking about Thorin sending off Philly and Killy into
to find a cave, to find a shelter.
Yep, to find shelter. He says, "There's nothing like looking. If you want to find something, or so Thorin said to the young dwarves, you certainly usually find something if you look, but it is not always quite the something you were after." I'm sorry. So it proved on this occasion. So he's doing that aside where he talks to the reader and says, you know how there's these situations where you go looking for something and you don't always find what you're looking for, but you always find something. Well, this is one of those cases. So again, to me, this harkens back to the style of creation, narrative creation, that he used when he first made The Hobbit. It was a story told to his children in their home. And so those kinds of asides to the actual listener are much more appropriate there than they are in an epic book style about a secondary world. And so it probably wouldn't have bothered his kids that he was doing those asides when he's talking about things they've experienced, and footballs too, for example. It's probably a more appropriate thing. but there is a little bit of a dissonance between that style and the style we've come to expect from Lord of the Rings.
I'm curious. I've never read The Hobbit with this thought in mind, which is, does he start moving away from that as the book goes on?
I'm going to be watching. Because I've only noticed it this read through of The Hobbit, even though I've read The Hobbit 11 times now. This is the.
I feel like we're reading it like he read it in 1960.
That's really true, actually. Yeah.
Especially after reading the way he readjusted his writing style in those first 3 chapters. I thought it interesting that. And I don't always like to go back to the films for The Hobbit. In fact, I never like going back to the films for The Hobbit. But they spent a lot of time on those stone giants. Right? They felt like they had to put those in, which is fine and all. But it's such a short and almost throwaway part of this chapter. Meaning, you could have had a grand thunder battle and them needing shelter without the stone giants. But I think his imagination went to a place, and probably as this type of story requires, these kinds of dangers that are frightening for children, but built up in a great imagination. And all he really wrote was, when he peeped out in the lightning flashes, he saw that across the valley the stone giants were out, and they were hurling. It's almost matter of fact. Oh, the stone giants, they're out, and they were hurling rocks at one another for a game, and catching them and tossing them down into the darkness, where they smashed among the trees far below, or splintered into little bits with a bang. Yep. Then came a wind and a rain, and the wind whipped out the rain and the hail about in every direction, so that an overhanging rock was no protection at all. Soon they were getting drenched. Anyway, so that's it, right? That's it. And there's one more line. They could hear the giants guffawing and shouting all over the mountainsides. So that's really it for the stone giants. But it's such a thing for so many people that, like, oh, there's stone giants in The Hobbit. That's weird.
Because it is throwaway, and he isn't sort of limiting his world. Like he became very focused in The Lord of the Rings on making sure that everything has a history, and it turns out the stone giants didn't make the cut. He didn't have a place to put them in, or didn't care to. I mean, you could just say they're a kind of large troll, I suppose. One of the things that I found a mild resonance to, and I don't know if this is what he was doing it on account of, but Jack and the Beanstalk, or Jack the Giant Killer, if you go back to the older version of that fairy tale. It's a story about little people in the land of giants, and this is clearly a land of giants. This is a dangerous place, the Misty Mountains, and it's their abode, not the dwarves, not the hobbits, not even Gandalf's. But they are here and then gone, and we never hear about giants again.
Well, let me ask you. So how big do you think these giants are? Peter Jackson made them absolutely enormous in The Hobbit, if I remember right.
Right.
But he says
they're catching boulders. So,
but yeah, okay. But he mentions the football, and so for me, I never quite imagined them as like the size of a quarter of a mountain, like what Peter Jackson did. They were enormous. To me, they're more like giant trolls.
I imagine them as something between 20 to 25 feet tall, like much larger than trolls. Trolls meet about probably 15-ish, maybe larger. But so big trolls, but not the size, not half the size of the mountain that they're throwing from into.
Yeah, I did because this did interest me. It's like, okay, did he try and retcon them into the Lord of the Rings and Middle Earth and the cosmology of Middle Earth at all? And in Appendix A of, I think it was Appendix A, in the Appendix of Lord of the Rings, he does mention stone trolls of the Westlands with a debased form of common speech. So there are stone trolls of the Westland.
Well, those are that's what Tom Burt and
do they call them stone trolls in here?
I would think like his reference to them having a debased form of common speech.
Sure.
But anyway, yeah.
No. See, I'd be curious if he uses that, and I thought that was the closest. Yeah, not in here. I'll have to look that up to see if there's any more interesting points about that. I'm sure it bothered him, right? When he gave up on writing the rewrite, he was probably thinking like
stone trolls. I think Aragorn calls them stone trolls.
Does he?
When they come across, maybe not, but I know they're called stone trolls at some point in the Lord of the Rings when they come across the statues. Maybe because they're made of stone at that point, but yeah.
Because they turn into stone too. Yeah, that's true. Huh.
But I'm sure that's something a quick search can find out. as our listeners can tell, we've prepared immensely for this part of the discussion.
Well, it just crossed my mind, right? This is a little bit of a free form where I want to be like, okay,
Exactly.
look, like he did mention stone trolls. Is that because
Well,
they turn into stone?
I mean, the word
Or
giant
maybe
is just a different thing, right?
maybe they if they turn into stone and then they're in a giant thunder battle and the lightning hits them because there's mithril in the ground, it turns them into life and they get an extra life and they become these stone giants. So these
You know
former
what?
stone trolls turned into.
Shut up.
Hmm.
I don't want you and your mithril.
You're right. He does call them stone trolls. Yep. Yeah. Huh.
So I would say the appendix A reference is probably referring to the trolls of the species that the
so
3 trolls were.
He doesn't actually try to retcon them into Middle Earth. No, there are no stone giants into Middle Earth. Actually, they're just in the Hobbit.
Just in the Hobbit, which is fine because there's plenty of things that are in the Hobbit that are not in Lord of the Rings, and some that made the cut and were transitioned. It's a really, I mean, I just find this place, this space where he's writing so interesting because he's clearly the world's starting to get larger. The places have more resonance, but he isn't quite at the level of the Lord of the Rings. So the Misty Mountains are treated differently here than they are in the Lord of the Rings.
Yeah.
Lord of the Rings are much more vast. There's a lot more detail to them. They're literally kind of a central feature in his map. The Misty Mountains are, and whether you're east of the Misty Mountains or west of the Misty Mountains is a big deal. Or if you're at the foothills of the Misty Mountains, you're in Isengard, and it's just the Gap of Rohan, and so it's just I see it as an enrichment process where he's going, he's transitioning from this child's tale told by a fire to a world which has more substance to it. We're still in the child's tale here, and so there's not a lot of detail given to the Misty Mountains themselves.
Yeah, when you think about like how brief it is, it's like for 3 pages maybe before 4 pages before they get into the cave.
Exactly,
and then they're done with the Misty Mountains. Whereas in the Lord of the Rings, it's really like 2.5 chapters.
So I was thinking about the way we've covered this in the last few episodes, and I thought we should probably go through and give a brief overview of the actual arc, because I know everyone's we focus in on specific points, but basically, so the basic story is not that hard to tell. It's they leave Rivendell, they travel up into the Misty Mountains for a long period of time. They're traveling for a while, many days, and then they enter the Misty Mountains, and they have these adventures. And first they almost die in the thunderstorms, and then there's the giants that are making life even harder. And then they send off the 2 dwarves, Philly and Killy, to look for something better than the overhang that they're under, and they find a cave. And so everyone decides, and Gandalf's a little leery about the cave, but everyone decides, well, it's better than this situation we got, so let's try the cave. And so they go and enter the cave, and it looks like it's a decent sized, big enough for them, but not too big, and it seems pretty safe. So they bed down in the cave. They talk about how they're going to spend the treasure from the dragon that they haven't got yet, and they all drift off to sleep. And Bilbo has a dream. So that's the arc of what we're covering today.
Yeah, and which we're just about done covering today. In fact, maybe next time we'll do it first. However, guys, if you can't read four pages before getting into this podcast,
I just figured,
no, that's a good idea.
People could have the flow of things. Interesting that he has a dream. Is this Bilbo's first dream? No, he had a dream back in the Shire, didn't he? Didn't he have a dream in chapter 1? It said something about his dream.
There is no mention of a dream anywhere. This is the first.
Okay.
Well, it gave him, so he had uncomfortable dreams. He noted he had in when the dwarves were there, they gave him uncomfortable dreams.
Okay, that's what I was thinking.
I'm just seeing if there's anything. Nope. But that's really it. So he was discomfort apparently gives him nightmares, which this is certainly a high level of discomfort. Now his dream, right? Tolkien brings dreams up a couple of times. I mean, really only one other primary time in the Fellowship of the Ring, where Frodo dreams about the sea, about the far green country under swift sunrise type of thing. That's what he sees, which is a little bit more positive than this one, where essentially it's this nightmare of being swallowed up by the world around you, by a cave. And
Right. And it's part of the ongoing juxtaposition between of Bilbo thinking about what he's left behind versus what he's experiencing now. So earlier in the chapter, it talks about Bilbo thinks about what's happening back in the Shire. He says, "The summer is getting on down below," thought Bilbo, "and haymaking is going on, and picnics. They will be harvesting and blackberrying before we even begin to go down the other side at this rate." And the others were thinking equally gloomy thoughts. So it's a comparison, right? He's lived a very sheltered, comfortable, and in a way kind of idyllic life in the Shire, and now he's gone on an adventure, and adventures aren't pleasant, and so he's contrasting what he's experiencing, and I think the dream is another extension of that.
Yeah, and the dream wakes him up. So he's imagining. Here, I'll read you exactly what Tolkien wrote. Somehow he could not go to sleep for a long while, and when he did sleep, he had very nasty dreams. He dreamed that a crack in the wall at the back of the cave got bigger and bigger and opened wider and wider, and he was very afraid, but could not call out or do anything but lie and look. Then he dreamed that the floor of the cave was giving way, and he was slipping, beginning to fall down, goodness knows to where, and that he woke with a horrible start and found out that part of his dream was true. A crack had opened at the back of the cave, and it was already a wide passage. He was just in time to see the last of his pony's tails disappearing into it. Of course, he gave a very loud yell, as loud a yell as a hobbit can give, which is surprising for their size.
And
so
we'll stop there, but
fortunate accident again that there's some sort of third party perhaps intervening in his waking up at this point. Not that it really helps at all.
I mean,
they're captured anyway.
Sure, but Gandalf gets to take down a few because of Bilbo's squeal. But it's fascinating to me that he's dreaming about a large crack opening. It's not. How does that? I mean, that's very specific and oddly specific, and it turns out exactly what's happening, which is an odd thing to have in a dream. Usually dreams have sort of these metaphorical, if they're worthy of note, they have a metaphorical a sense to them or connection with the real world, where this does not. This is an extremely specific connection to the real world, a literal, in fact, connection to the real world. Almost like he's seeing what he can't with his eyes closed.
Yeah. So do you think this means one? Okay, like there's kind of a little conjecture here. Do you think this is one, like this is Tolkien enjoying the idea that there's a prime mover still moving? Or is this perhaps something that was recognized at the back of the cave and that itched, that created a mental itch in him, and then when he fell asleep, that was that grew into this nightmare of what was actually going to happen? Perhaps Fili and Kili, as Thorin asked, they were not quite as thorough as they should have been, and they were more like, let's just get out of the rain and the thunder and the rocks and the lightning.
Well, I mean, that's fair, but I also think it says when they actually came in, the wizard was taking no risks. He lit up his wand as he did that day in Bilbo's dining room, and by its light, they explored the cave from end to end. So it wasn't a matter of non-exploration. It seemed quite a fair size, but not too large and mysterious. It had a dry floor and some comfortable nooks. At one end, there was a room for ponies, and there they stood, mighty glad of the change, steaming and champing at their nose bags. Oin and Gloin wanted to light a fire at the door to dry their clothes, but Gandalf would not hear of it. Blah, blah, blah. So they fully explored the cave. The crack that opens is basically a secret door. You can't. They couldn't have seen it. Yeah. And so it's not Fili and Kili's fault.
So who made the door? Is this a dwarven door? Is this an orcan door?
I think it's a goblin. I think it's a goblin door.
Goblin door.
Yep.
Goblins have that capability.
I think they do. I mean, they have a kind of cleverness to them. They have a lot of.
But I will say, the only time there are doors in mountains are dwarven doors. There are no other doors that we ever see. We've got Moria, and we've got the door to the Lonely Mountain.
That's fair. Maybe it is a dwarven door. That
I
they've
bet
just discovered.
it's it's like the kids prank, the young dwarfs. They needed a back door to get away from mom and dad, and so they found a way. They found an opening. They got a ring of power, and they listened to the cave, and they found a thin part where they could create a door. Just like anyway.
Yeah, absolutely. I'll go with that. I do like the fact, and I've forgotten about this, that they smoke and blow, and Gandalf uses his magic to turn the smoke colored.
We haven't gotten to that point yet. Shh.
What are you talking about? No,
Wait.
No, he does. That's before the dream.
Oh, right. Sorry, I thought you meant about about giving the great crack in the fire.
Nope,
okay,
nope.
Yeah.
I'm talking about them smoking and blowing smoke rings. And,
okay. Yes.
That was when they were talking about how they're going to spend the treasure.
That's right.
So,
Sorry.
Yep.
All right.
There's more smoke to come from Gandalf. Yes, that is true.
Yes. Right. Okay.
Yep.
Go ahead.
I was just going to say the one last thing I have to say about this episode, or this in this episode about this part of the chapter, is this chapter it's become clear to me over the years. When I was a kid, as our listeners will know, I was big into Dungeons and Dragons, and even when I was a young man, I was still doing it with my friends, and this whole panorama that Tolkien has laid out. It's a well-known fact that Dungeons and Dragons was based upon Tolkien's world. It has exactly, it has his races of orcs and halflings and dwarves and elves and men, and it has
rangers.
It has rangers, and it has people with different classes. You have burglars, and you have wizards, and you have rangers, and you have warriors and scouts. And anyway, it basically Dungeons and Dragons took Tolkien's world and then they made their own modifications. So that's fair enough from a backdrop perspective. But this particular point in The Hobbit is when I believe the whole I don't know what you call it, the motive setting for Dungeons and Dragons happens. So whenever you're playing Dungeons and Dragons, or at least the base form of Dungeons and Dragons, you have a party. And the party has a certain number of people, and they all have their own talents, and they get together. There's usually a wizard in there, and there's usually a burglar in there, and there's usually some, warriors, and they go on an adventure, and they go into wild places. And the stereotype, the classic stereotype of Dungeons and Dragons is you find a door underground into some cave or mountain somewhere, and you go exploring it. And it struck me that this episode is, in fact, the motive spark for the entire idea of the game of Dungeons and Dragons. I mean, in Dungeons and Dragons, you're very concerned with maps, and you map out the tunnels and the rooms and the where the monsters are and all this. And this is just a lift directly from what's happening here in The Hobbit. So this was the OG Dungeons and Dragons. That's my line for today. What's this particular chapter? Chapter 4, The Hobbit chapter 4 is the source material for Dungeons and Dragons as a which has become a huge part of our culture, now.
Well, I mean, when you think back, every fantasy story is essentially going back to the foundation that he laid here in The Hobbit. Every single one that we have today, with how evil is defined, with how there are, for lack of a better term, MacGuffins that have to be dealt with, like rings or swords or things like that. And and there are mountains that have doors that open. Like nobody really like that wasn't a thing before this very much. I mean, maybe it was in some areas, but it wasn't part of modern culture. It wasn't part of the everyday discussion language that we have. Like, oh yeah, they're in The Hobbit, right? They're stone doors that open. Anyway, yes, I never played Dungeons and Dragons, so I will allow you to make those.
Nod your head sagely and
sure,
and move on. I understand.
Yes, right. I don't deal with demonic things like no. I'm joking. Child of the 90s and 80s. There it is.
Yep.
All right. So that's a brief little look at everything up there. Now we get into the orcs and the goblins and everything like that. And speaking of orcs and goblins, guys, we are going to take a look at are there differences between orcs and goblins in our extended edition, which you can get to by going to theonering.com/member. You can watch it or you can listen to it in your podcast app or theonering.com/Patreon. So we'll take a look at that. And then we're also going to briefly talk about what we think Tolkien would have changed in this part of chapter 4 if he had continued with the rewrite. So We'll see you guys on the other side. Thanks for joining us next week. The second 2/3 of this chapter 4, Overhill and Underhill. See you then.
Enjoy your week, freeloaders.